Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
Living While Human, the book from Arwinder Kaur, out now. It is a weighty book with lots to say, and I am excited to get the chance to talk about it with her. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with your father, Daddy G, and the fact that you talk about how he was a writer, and his
right.
first book was a book of maxims, or maybe his most famous book was a book of maxims, and that you considered this a book of maxims. Did you take your inspiration for writing this from him? Is that where that came from?
That would be a very natural conclusion for sure. Actually, my father was never a writer. Initially, he's never really had a formal education. He had religious instruction and religious upbringing, and so he knew about the holy, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scriptures, and he knew about how to, perform ceremonies and do music and all of that. And he was completely self-taught, self-educated. And when he was in Canada, he had a bad accident working in a mill, and he injured his back and became disabled. And that gave him time to start putting some things in writing. And he'd always been very poetic. He would write, lyrics, songs, sometimes just like funny things. He had a great sense of humor, but he was he was a thinker and a very, very sort of principled. I did, ironically, I never really did it consciously, but yeah, that's exactly in a way I'm sort of following in his footsteps, because that is, in fact, his first book that he wrote was a book of maxims, little one, line sort of sentence sayings, sort of like Confucius sayings. That was published actually in England and even translated there into English. It was one of the only books that was translated. And the rest of his books were all published in India while he was there. And they were all more religious oriented, about the scriptures, about philosophy. But there was one that was his autobiography and his whole journey. And so there are definitely parallels, because when I look at the way I've structured my book, first I was starting with maxims, and then when I started looking into publishing, it was the editor that said, well, nobody knows you, and you should really talk a little bit about yourself. And so that's how I tacked on a little extra about coming to Canada, and I started the book from there. And then she said, well, I think you should add how you got to Canada in the first place. So then I added so much more about our history. And so then it just became more of an autobiography, which I never intended, but it actually works better because it lays the foundation for my life lessons. So yeah, in a sense, I am following in my father's footsteps, and I'm just sad that he wasn't here to see that, because I think he would have been very proud and very happy that I had published something.
Understandably. Now, the maxims come towards the end of the book as it exists now, but like you said, you kind of written those first. Is that what you took to the editor? And then at that point, the editor was the one who said, like, this needs to also be a memoir?
That's right. That's all I was going to do. I was just going to publish this compass. And I thought, well, that's all I have to say. I think these would be interesting for people, and might be a nice little read. So yeah, I had not really written out any of that other stuff. I kind of tried, and I thought, oh, that's just too much. And I never had a diary, and that's another thing I was different from what my father did. My father was always keeping journals and diaries. I should have learned that part too, but I didn't. So during all of the travels and all of the experiences, I had to kind of try to recollect to the best of my abilities. And unfortunately, even to this day, I'm remembering stories and I'm thinking, oh, wow, I wish I'd ever put that in the book. That was so interesting. So that's my major regret. But my maxims are just something I was just always jotting down. Something would come to my mind and I would put it down. And it just kept building and building. And I had so many pages, and I thought, I'm still writing them. I'm still coming up with new ones. So So, yeah, that was just the purpose. And I had no thought of putting anything further about myself in there.
So the diarizing was simply these thoughts, not ever kind of like what I did or where I was at, those kinds of like meat and potatoes.
Yeah, what happened, when, where, what the context was, just all kinds of other details and just stories. There were so many. And I could have just written so many more incidences and examples. And, it could have just been so big. It'd be probably like my dad's, numerous volumes. And I left out so much personal stuff. I mean, that whole, you know, focus of my book really just, I didn't want to make it about myself that much. And I really wanted to focus on those other bigger issues. So I really haven't talked anything about my family, my personal life, the struggles and what kinds of issues people in my family may have faced that were extremely challenging and certainly made life in some ways quite difficult, but I didn't want to get distracted with all of that because it just would have become a very different book then.
So what is included? Did you wrestle with that inclusion?
Well, there was a part of me that always knew I wasn't going to get into real private details. I just think it's really hard for people, for siblings, because they are not necessarily going to want me to talk about things or mention aspects of their life, which were very private. I mean, now a couple of my brothers have actually passed away. One was in 2018, and the other one just passed away actually less than a year ago. And so one could say, well, yeah, I could certainly talk about them now, but the one he just passed away last year, he might not have wanted that. So now, sure, I could probably talk more about what some of their struggles and challenges were, but then again, I thought, okay, everybody has those kinds of stories. Everybody has, well, my childhood was tough and, these were my struggles and this is what I had to deal with, and there's a part of me that just says, well, everybody has that story. Everybody has those struggles. And I didn't particularly think I would be adding anything fresh or new perspective about what my struggles were with regards to, family of origin issues. So, yeah, I didn't really struggle with it so much. I think I always kind of knew I wasn't really going to delve into that too much.
Now, you mentioned you obviously didn't keep journals. So then the recollection process, like you said, you're still thinking of things that might have been included, but what was that process like? Did you, kind of like write like age 8, where was I? Age 9, where was I? Like those kinds of things?
Well, I mean, those 2 years of traveling are definitely so ingrained. I mean, they were such powerful memories and experiences. So some of them were just, I had repeated them so many times. People, I would talk to them about my travels and I would say, oh, this happened. And I remember when that happened. And, we had to jump onto a moving train or whatever the situation was. And people would always say, wow, that's fascinating. You should really write a book about that. I didn't really think about it as being all that fascinating or interesting because to me it was just reality, it's just what happened. But when I would talk about it to other people, I would get very, excited, enthusiastic, and I would really tap into all of those experiences. And I think so there I sort of ingrained them a little bit more. They kind of took a deeper root in my psyche. But yeah, like I say, there were instances that I don't even talk about, like, walking through the markets or, getting groped or something like that, and how I dealt with that when it happened, and which was probably unusual for a girl to respond the way that I did. I was pretty aggressive about my reaction. So just things like that. My sister and I were pretty reluctant to go anywhere because we just had so many of those kinds of experiences, and we didn't like it, and we weren't feeling very safe. But that was just the way things were there. So yeah, there's a lot of stories, a lot of things that I just didn't necessarily get into because it just, at what point do you say, okay, if I include that and I include that, I mean, nobody wants to read a 1,000 pages. Though the incidences were all interesting, and maybe I'd have to do something else that would capture some of those other moments. But yeah, at some point I kind of had to just let it sort of flow. And I was actually getting a bit tired of the whole, like I was getting so tired of reading my own story that I was getting sort of losing the joy of the writing process, because I'm not really a writer. And so I would write all this stuff, send it in, and then the editor would suggest things, and then I would change something or I would add something again. And then before I knew it, I thought this could go on forever. And at some point I gotta get this finished. And how am I going to do that? So it was just a kind of a process I didn't have like a finished manuscript like a lot of other people probably do. It was a free flowing thing that was just evolving as I was working on it. So probably not recommended to do it that way.
Probably a more unusual process. Now, the maxim section you call the compass. I'm curious if you developed this compass because in your memoir portion, you bounce around a lot. And it seems like maybe, like you said, everyone has their issues growing up, but like you bounce around, that seems to be kind of something that you need a compass to develop.
Yeah. When you say bounce around, you mean the traveling?
Yeah, and being kind of uprooted a bit.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that way. Yeah, I don't know if that was the reason. I think it had more to do with me. Yeah. I don't think what you're saying is not accurate. I think it probably is. We did have a fair amount of chaos in our lives, and I think our parents struggled. When they came from such a traditional background, they have no idea on how to raise children in an environment that is so completely different. They come from a society where everything is based on family first and community first. Individualism isn't really allowed to exist. You don't do just things for yourself and make decisions independent of your family and so forth. So I think for them, they had no idea what the challenges were for us in the outside world, whether it be how we dress, the fact that, you're not supposed to cut your hair, all the restrictions, and then just exposure, to things like drugs or, all of those sort of like mental health challenges of what children have to go through. We lived at a time when this is very unusual. We were the only Indian people in the whole school. I mean, talk about being a, anomaly and not fitting in. And then, of course, my brother's wearing a turban that, nobody knew what we were. So I think that had a lot of challenges. And I think that, when children are little, sometimes they're going to be affected by not being accepted by the mainstream or ridiculed, humiliated, whatever the case may be. So those were things that our parents really didn't know much about. And as I point out in my book, back then we didn't have what is common now, English as a second language. We have multicultural workers. We have all kinds of people, social workers, community liaison workers, people that would help with the transition. And back then, you're just that's it. You're in school and, you just deal with it we didn't really complain about it. We just tried to sometimes live a very split sort of life. My sister would change when she got to school. She'd put on pantyhose and, something else and put on makeup or something. So, yeah, it definitely, there are those kinds of cultural identity issues. And then not being part of the mainstream is also very difficult. So from that perspective, yeah, I think early on, I realized that I needed somebody, mentors, which I point out in my book as well, which I was thirsty for mentors at a young age. I just always felt comfortable with people 30 years my senior, and those were the people that I sought out or would spend most of my time with. So while I was traveling, I was always just a very kind of philosophical, curious person. And I was always sort of more reflective, I think, in the family. Maybe then in that regard, I was more like my father. And I would just look at things from a very different perspective, and whereas like someone else in my family might have been really stressed with some of the experiences we were having day to day, in India, I was just taking it all in pretty, nonchalantly, like, well, this is our life right now. This is how people live. And I was just curious about all of that and how it would have affected me had I been raised there and had I been living there. Yeah. So I think in terms of who I was as a person, I think some of that was already there when I was very young, just much more philosophical, serious, and, just like to question, try to make sense. I always had to try to understand things, why things are the way they are. And so Yeah, I think that you're right. In some ways, we were uprooted a lot, though I never saw that when we traveled. I didn't never saw that as a negative thing. That was just a tremendously important time for personal development and growth. And as I say, I referred to it, I used to refer to it as a tour of duty because the experiences were so intense and dramatic, and they changed me fundamentally, into who I became. So I never saw that as a bad thing. And I've always promoted people should get out of their comfort zone, travel not as tourists in hotels, but to just get out and actually live with the people. That's when you really learn things and learn lessons and find new perspectives on how to live a healthy life. And that's not necessarily an easy life.
Well, speaking of learning things from people, you mentioned the mentors. I'm glad you brought them up because it's through them that you discover Daniel Quinn's Ishmael.
Funny enough, that was a book that was just getting circulated. My mentors definitely introduced me, like, for example, Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring. We talked about those kinds of issues, environmental issues. They were all feminist. So I had really great people with lots of information, and they were definitely people who lived by principles. And so that's where a lot of that started taking root. My father was also like that. But Ishmael was actually a book that was just getting circulated. And my sister, actually, who was living in Austin, Texas at the time, she's a musician, and it had come to her. And she said, "Oh, you might want to check this out." And so, yeah, that's how I found out about it. It was just through her. And obviously, as I mentioned in my book, completely, again, just as traveling had done, that one book, just reading it, completely transformed me and my life again into a whole sort of ecological perspective and compassion that I didn't have. So it was very, very, I think I describe it in my book. After reading it, it was like having a huge Band-Aid sort of ripped from my soul and exposing my deepest being into the pain, into the horror, really, of what we were doing to all the other species and planet and to ourselves. And it devastated me. I mean, I must have been grieving and crying. I must have been just crying. I cried for weeks after reading it, and everybody else I gave the book to had the same reaction. So it was definitely a very moving book, and I would recommend it to anybody. And it's an easy read as well.
Credit to your sister then. I apologize. I think maybe in reading the mentor section conflated the fact that you read Ishmael with it. This book, though, I think owes a bit of a debt. Like, particularly there's a significant chunk of it about the environment and about humanity basically being like the mutant or cancerous cells. And that
that's how I
I'm exactly what I'm taking my words from you. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about developing that section of the book, and like, did you go back to Ishmael?
I have read Ishmael numerous times anyway. I mean, I'd already read it 6, 7, 8 times. And from time to time, I will still pick it up again and say, "Oh, yeah, what was that part where he was talking about this?" And again, though I didn't try to do it intentionally, and he has an analogy. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Ishmael, but he has an analogy also in Ishmael where he talks about, this analogy of us being on a flight, and we don't know that we're in free fall. And we just keep seeing things are moving faster, faster, faster. We're getting closer to the ground, but we just keep saying, "Hey, look at us. We're still fine. We're still fine. We're still fine." Until, of course, we're not and we crash. But until then, everybody thinks we're fine. So that was kind of an analogy that he had. And then I had this cancer analogy, which, I think to a lot of people that sounds horrible and disturbing. But I think the way that I describe it, it actually really fits. And it doesn't mean that we're intentionally trying to be that, but the effect of that on the planet and on how we are sort of not just destroying the planet, but also our whole cultural fabric of community and how our species live so differently from every other species on this planet. So in a sense, it is a mutation. And I don't include the indigenous culture in that. I don't include them as being part of this mutant culture.
No, and it's the uncontrolled growth that you kind of equate with like cancerous cells. They grow and attack other cells.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I think how I described it was, if you look at the earth, the whole earth as our body. The human body is like, for example, earth. So Earth has all these complex systems, just like in our bodies. We have all these complex systems that are all working perfectly together to make our body operate and function and grow and do everything that it has to do to survive and to thrive. And so if we looked at the planet, the Earth as a body and all the ecosystem within it, all the, trees, the animals, the flowers, the fauna, the people, everything within that earth, the water, everything as all different cells in a body, right? And so all of those cells, the ecology, are all working together just like our body to keep everything healthy, functioning, developing, growing, and making everything work in concert together. So that's what the ecology has been doing for millions of years. And then it's just like in the human body, if we disrupt it or we add something poisonous or toxic to it, that disrupts our whole body. We put it into a crisis where our immune system and all these other things have to sort of start operating. All the different cells of our body start working to try to rid our body of this thing that is harming us. So just like the cancer cell is not saying, I want to kill this person. I want to kill this host, because obviously they will die too if they kill the host. But that's not how a cancer cell works. It just continues to operate and grow and grow and grow. And ultimately, obviously, if allowed to go unchecked and it's not treated and not removed, then obviously the host will die, which is us. And in this sense, it's the planet Earth. So that's what's happening. Every time we're cutting down forest, making a species extinct, cutting down our lungs, literally, the trees, polluting the waters, every time we're doing these things, adding too many people on the planet for the planet to survive, we are disrupting the ecosystem and the immune system of the Earth itself. And that's what's happening now, is it's become weaker and weaker and weaker. And all of those systems that were working in a perfectly balanced way, as we can see, have now been put into total disruption and chaos. But we're still continuing on just as a mutant gene would do. We're just continuing on regardless. Even though we're told we're going to die, we're killing the planet and we will also die. We are just continuing on, boldly charge ahead, regardless of where it leads, even if that means killing the host, our Earth. So that's why I use that analogy, and not because I'm trying to say we're inherently evil and that we're just, we're sick people. There are lots of cultures still, as I point out, like indigenous cultures in different places around the world, that are living in a way that is not like a mutant gene. They are still living in harmony, as do other species, to continue their way of life. And they're doing that. But again, they are also being exterminated. So that base is getting smaller and smaller, and we're on the verge of losing. Luckily, the indigenous communities are making a comeback. They are getting stronger voice, and we need them because they're the ones who are actually going to be able to get us back onto what I call that nature has a blueprint for how we live. And just like humans, I talk about the compass. Compass is about how an individual, a human being, an individual might want to live within a community of other, individuals. How do we navigate ourselves within our, human existence? But the nature, the Earth, actually also has a blueprint on how to be successful and to survive. And that blueprint is being abided by and followed by every single species on this planet, except us.
Is that the hardest section to write because of like the inherent frustration with seeing that play out?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, this is the thing, is once you become like, I call myself a super empath. I'm very empathetic, and I feel like my level of empathy and compassion, like I feel pain of other people, and I feel pain when I see something cruel happening to an animal, or I see an image. I mean, I have to change it. I don't want to watch it because I don't need to keep looking at that. I'm all too well aware of the cruelty, that we're inflicting on all these other beings. And it's a struggle to be fully aware of that, to take it in and to try to do something about it. But I have to be mindful that I can't just immerse myself so much in that it becomes, hopeless. And, I have to keep trying to find some of the positive stories, which there are. And there are sometimes, things that I can look at that say, oh, here's a species that's now been removed from the endangered list, or these are making a comeback, or this, salmon are back where we haven't seen them for a long time, and things like that. And that's momentarily sort of reassuring. But then when I look at the fact that, there's 400,000 babies being born a day, we're living on a finite planet, that doesn't bode well for all of those species, because, as long as we have to keep cutting down forests and cutting down areas that are, habitat for hundreds of thousands of other species, we are not going to be able to save them, because we have to keep cutting down to build more places for us to live. And that, every time I see a new construction site with another, complex going up, I'm like, oh my God, where's this going to stop? And I think the frustrating thing for me is that it's happening, that we're continuing on with this total population expansion without realizing, if you look at the planet, you can see that 3/4 of it is water. 75% of the earth is water, which means we're actually only living on 1/4 of the planet. That's where 8 billion people are living and growing. So you don't have to be a scientist or a mathematician to figure out that is not as sustainable for us in terms of where we're going to live and what we're going to eat. But also it's unsustainable for all the other species out there, because it's just a matter of time before all of that gets overtaken. So those are the kinds of things that are most pressing to me. And what bothers me more than a lot of these things is the fact that no one wants to touch that subject. No one wants to talk about it. Even environmental organizations, I have all kinds of disagreements with them. And I do challenge them on that all the time and say, like, I have no problem donating money to your cause, but when are you going to talk about population? At least it has to be part of the equation. We cannot just say, let's save this and save that. I mean, I'm donating to things all the time, but how can I save the tigers in a certain place in India when the population just keeps overrunning the area? It doesn't matter how hard I want to try to do that. It's just simply not going to happen, because when human needs are put against any other species needs, well, we know what happens. Ours prevails. And so this is why I do talk about it a lot in my book. The editor was actually a little bit, I won't say totally discouraging, but she was, obviously questioned it a little bit, saying, well, people are going to think, you're against anybody having children. I said, I'm not saying that, but I'm also saying we have to consider eco-friendly family planning. It's just not realistic for people to have 7, 9 kids. And where are the resources? When you live in a city like we do, every year the government is faced with the same thing. The infrastructure is bursting at the seams. Not enough housing, not enough beds, not enough hospital beds, not enough school student teacher ratios, not enough. There's never enough resources, and the infrastructure cannot ever maintain the people that we have here now. But nobody ever says, listen, we've got to look at this. What does nature do? Nature never allows the population to outstrip its available resources. That's how all of them survive. Population, always balances itself. And we're the only species that do not do that, even though we have complete control over our reproduction. And we can make those decisions and choices. And yet it's still so taboo. I think things are getting a little more open now. But for me, as a person who's now 67, I knew as a teenager I wasn't going to have kids. And I got a lot of hostility and a lot of people that were actually really almost, no, I won't say violent, but they were very hostile about my situation. Just couldn't accept it. And it didn't matter what I said about why I didn't want to have kids. They just simply wouldn't accept it and said, no, That's you have to. You'll change your mind. And I found that very interesting, and I wasn't ever really able to reconcile why that was causing so much discomfort to people. It's one of the most important decisions that we make in our life.
Speaking of resources, we are out of time. The book is Living While Human, Arwinder Kaur. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you, and maybe we'll have part 2 one day.